Wright's career was flourishing in the late 30s, as we saw earlier with the Hannah House, the Johnson Wax Building, and Falling Water. At that time, he could afford to build a second house on the West Coast in Arizona or in the mid-United States. And that responds quite well to the landscape. It's in the desert, so it uses a lot of the natural elements of the site, and a lot of the design is particularly embedded in what the context is. So where did he come up with this design?
So as you point out, there are big differences between Falling Water, Johnson Wax, Hannah House. And each is responsive to its landscape. So Wright tries to avoid a formula. Some architects, they do a certain kind of house. You commission them, you're going to get one of those houses. Wright is much more explorative. So these are the three houses Wright lived his life in. First is the Frank Lloyd Wright house that we saw early in our course, and he was there from 1889 to 1909 for 20 years. And then these two till his death, 1911 to 1959, he's in Taliesin East at Spring Green, Wisconsin, not too far from Racine, where the Johnson Wax was. And beautiful rolling hills of landscape, we'll see in a minute, but 6 feet of snow in the winter. So he's working on a project in Arizona, and he says, oh, it's pretty nice here in the winter. And so he buys land near Scottsdale and builds what's called Taliesin West. And he's there from 1937 to 1959. And he would go back and forth, summers in Wisconsin, winters in Arizona. You don't want to be in Arizona in the summer. We're talking 110 degrees at least. And he had caravans of automobiles. He liked Packards, and painted them all kind of a rust red. And the whole crew would pack up all the office and everything, and they go off, two trips a year. So Wright's mother was born in Wales, and Taliesin was a 6th century Celtic British poet whose work has survived in a Welsh manuscript. So he's sort of the bard poet of Wales, Taliesin, and it means shining brow. So Wright adopted that name, and he'd like to put his buildings on the brow of the hill, not the top, but into the slope. And so Spring Green, Wisconsin, and then Scottsdale, Arizona. So we looked at this earlier, but let's look again at Taliesin East. We see it very much into its rolling landscape. This was built, there are 3 of these, there were 2 fires, and they're continually being added on to. Very shoddy details. They just slap these things together. What we're looking at here is a very simple construction, chicken wire over boards and then stuccoed. So when you get up close, it's like, we sure this, but this is students doing the work, and we're not talking about big budgets here. So here we are in aerial view, and we get a sense of the area, lots of water, lots of dairy farms around here, and then just the landscape, just rolling hills, lushly green. And then coming in, it's a compound, courtyard, and then we come inside, and I'm here when they've just packed off the office. They had just left for Arizona, so all the tables are bare. And so he's into this kind of a roof that's sort of like containing you. Here's some of his Japanese prints. These chairs are added later. They're from the custom furniture from the Martin House. And they're available today. They're very expensive. You can buy those chairs. And then this is a chapel by Silsby, the architect Wright worked for, one of his first jobs. And for a while, right next to it, he was buried, but he's since been moved to Taliesin West. So this is in Arizona. And here he's responding to the this kind of a harsh, rocky landscape, using these boulders as the aggregate in his concrete, a lot of redwood, so he can have the wood exposed. Here we see it against the landscape, canvas roofs here to let light into the drafting areas. And he's got several different grids going on here. This is a compound that had the apprentices, his own apartments, the office, and then also things like they would put on plays, have concerts, they did their own entertainment. So there's a little theater here. This is the main complex with this triangular grid. Here's some of these trusses in redwood. Some of the giant aggregate concrete.
Pretty impressive house, right? And the scale is quite huge.
Yeah, well, it includes, the drafting areas. You can tell this photograph was made before we went fully computer.
That would indeed, yeah. And how about how many people used to live and work here?
There could be maybe around 30 when they're going full bore. It was, when we look at the work Wright did, up to the Guggenheim Museum, it was a substantial office to do that kind of stuff.
Oh, sure.
So he had a real office going.
And the Guggenheim was probably designed in here, in the Taliesin.
These are the only two places he was. There's no other office. It isn't like he had an office in the city. This was it. And famously, we have quote from Lao Tzu, the reality of the building does not lie in the roof and walls, but the space to be within. And then another anecdote, they scour the area and collect rocks that have petroglyphs on them. Now you're not supposed to move them. But at that time, nobody cared. So these are from very early Indians, not the ones who were there more recently. And Wright said, when you find the rock, determine the orientation, which part is facing north. And when we bring it to the compound, we want to have it the same. And somebody says, why are you doing that? He says, so that after the white man has gone and the red man returns, there'll be evidence that there was intelligent life here.
Right.
So, a real respect for this earlier tradition. Here are the apprentices at work, picnicking, building the place, working on drawings. There's this huge community, and they were growing their own food and doing their own cooking, and so it was a real experience. Now, there's a very tiny school there, Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture at Taliesin West. Actually, it goes back and forth. It's both east and west. And each student builds their own house, their own little room. And you can either build one from scratch, you can move into one from a former student and modify it. So it's quite an enjoyable tour around the landscape, seeing these little constructions. So, what does it mean that one person has such extensive homes? It's something to think about. Is this something we're jealous of, or how do we feel about these compounds of Wright's?
And I'm quite curious about the life and community that he was able to build, no? And he lived here with his third wife, Olgivanna, and in fact, apparently the idea of the fellowship was hers. No? When he was out of work in the late 20s, she was the one that invited him to start a school, and he was charging at that time $600 tuition, which was a lot of money for the 20s, no? Particularly during the Depression. So Olgivanna was the one who, in a way, built the community around him, and so she was inviting the students. She was totally managing the life of this settlement. And as we know, she was a student of Gurdjieff. So Gurdjieff, the famous mystic and spiritual leader and teacher, He was a resident in Taliesin for about a year, and he was the one who, in fact, later helped with the commission of the Guggenheim and some other projects. So how did the life of this community work, and what was the impact and the relationship between the work produced there and the actual life in the fellowship?
Well, Wright had this, this, again, very Jeffersonian vision, and was able to some extent, implement it. And so they would grow food, and I guess if they didn't harvest as much wheat as they needed, they just go into town and buy flour. It wasn't like a contest, but they'd grow their food, and so the students are out there figuring out tractors, figuring out harvesting, figuring out how you get the wheat milled, and then they had big cooking operations going on to prepare the meals. And as I said, making their own entertainment, so there'd be concerts in the evening. So if we sort of wanted to idealize what a commune might be like, he actually accomplished it. And then the other thing that would have really helped is that they were there for a reason. They had to get the drawings done. They had actual work to do. And there were periods of time when there was less work than they would have liked, but when things were really rolling, there was plenty of work to do. And it was an incredible experience for some of these young people, men and women, who I met the woman, she's in her 90s, tooling around in her motorized wheelchair. So, oh yeah, she built Taliesin West. She was in charge of that. And as I said, I met the person who was a job captain on Johnson Wax. So this is quite an opportunity for these people in launching careers to have the experience to work on these projects, and at the same time being part of these communities.
Pretty impressive, and quite a story, So he was able to, in a way, build his idea of community and society on a smaller scale throughout his fellowship. I had the pleasure to meet Pfaffer Keating Clay, who was one of the apprentices in the fellowship, the son-in-law of Siegfried Giedion, the famous architectural historian of the modern age. And he worked with Le Corbusier, with Mies, and finally with Frank Lloyd Wright. So he was telling me the story of his life in the fellowship. So he said that when a student would arrive and he traveled and walked through the desert to get to Taliesin West, because there was no bus or there was no transportation. He had to walk, with his backpack to get to the house. And he said, once you get to the house, old Giovanna had prepared everything. And every student would be treated as a prince the first day. So they would be located in the guest house, and they would be served the best meal ever to be received. And then the next day, they would be treated in the worst possible way. They would send him to the desert to bury the trash. They would make him clean the potatoes in the kitchens and wash the floors. So it was the complete contrast. So that was part of the initiation process of arriving in the fellowship. So there were quite a lot of stories in there, and living in this utopian community in the middle of the desert, in the middle of nowhere, was certainly a place for it to happen.
There, as we mentioned in the beginning, there's a ton of books about Frank Lloyd Wright, and so I'm not even listening. I mean, it'll be in your course material, but I've only included a few mentions in our lectures. But someone should do a book just of anecdotes.
Oh, sure. I'm sure they exist quite alone.
Right. So that wraps up part 4, the 30s, and now we'll go on to part 5, the 50s.
Thank you, John.